Hi everyone. My name's Rob and I'm a hobbyist game dev and in general a fan of small indie developers. Since the pandemic this year gave us a lot of chances to explore new hobbies, I signed up for Udemy courses to learn Unity since the idea of game creation has always seemed so alien to me. I went to school for programming, and while I enjoy my own small projects, I've never liked having to do it for work, so I don't actually do much there besides minor scripting. So being able to keep these concepts in my mind with a new hobby seemed like a great idea. While I enjoyed learning many core and intermediate features of Unity, I found myself always starting to fall into what I've seen others describe as the lesson trap. I made a few small microgames here and there, but always felt like I needed to finish just one more tutorial before I actually dove into making even the simplest of full experiences. Right now, I'm even in the middle of a pretty thorough RPG making course, but after forcing myself to decide to actually jump into a project, even if I'm going to learn better practices later, I've been able to see the start of my ideas take shape, which is what brings us to now. I decided to record my progress from the start, both because I've watched and enjoyed a lot of devlogs and hope someday I can provide similar entertainment, as well as because I just really like sharing what I'm doing, either by streaming or making these sorts of videos. I'm even more of a noob at video editing than game creation though, so you're gonna have to forgive me there. So what kind of game did I want to make? Well, after deciding I'd wait a bit to make my dream games, an idea came to my head to make something set on the surface of Mars. Details quickly started coming in to me about what type of game it would be. I decided on a sort of 3D exploration, searching for hidden items beneath the surface using some sort of tool. To make it more involved than a point and click, I also figured I'd add a sort of platforming to it. So now we have a 3D platformer. Great. What would the basic premise be? Maybe you find yourself alone on Mars and need to search for evidence about what happened to the rest of your crew. And in the corner of my mind, I thought about a neat twist ending, but we'll get to that later. I sketched a very brief sky view of what the map might look like, and with that I now had all the info I needed to get the ball rolling and put some initial code together. I started by finding a Martian surface image online and applying it as the terrain in my scene just to get inspired with a view of what the game might actually look like. I know I could have jumped right into coding, but I felt like at least seeing something more than a blank scene would give me the drive I needed. This is going to change eventually, but I spent a bit of time just making some general terrain features and trying to copy what the surface image had captured in order to have a realistic atmosphereless surface. I then got to work with some of the initial coding. I started writing a character controller of my own before remembering that Unity's standard assets contained exactly what I needed for a first-person character controller. As I was importing the standard assets, I started putting together some rules and compromises for myself so that I could actually see this little project through to the end. 1. Use other people's work. I can and have written things from scratch, but since I'm trying to do this as a way to actually put out a complete, if not short, game, and I'm not doing it as part of a game jam or anything commercial, I should just help myself by using things that have already been made for me. Whether that's Unity's code like this, or 3D models, or terrain, or maybe even music, though we'll see about that. I can always go back and replace things with my own work later as additional challenges. And number 2, just get the code written. This is sort of a two-parter. When it comes to coding, I have a tendency to over-engineer everything. I need to stop doing that. So the first part is to just make something that works and gradually add to it as needed, instead of trying to lay out what I might need for the whole game from the start. The second part is to not worry immediately if the code or setup makes the most sense. It's funny because when going through Unity courses, I can see how the teachers set up a script or a group of game objects and think, yeah, that makes perfect sense. But when it comes time to do it on my own, I second guess everything and probably end up with a mess that I'll be cleaning up later. For now though, embracing that mess is part of getting something made from scratch. With movement done and some ideals made for me to try to stick through on this project, I started the first original features of the game. I set up a main GUI canvas with some placeholder text about items found. I also added some sliders to the bottom, as eventually I plan on having some sort of radar or sensor that reacts to the nearest hidden item, and for now would use those sliders to get some basic code written. I spent the rest of my first day working on it, setting up logic for the sensor and making it properly send data to the graphic, which for now is just the sliding bars on the screen. While my idea for the radar was simple, this ended up being the most complicated part so far. Here's how I pictured it working. The sensor has 3 columns of 5 lights. The closer you are to the nearest item to find, the more lights light up. So if you're maybe 100 feet away from an item that's directly in front of you, the center column would have 2 or 3 lights lit and you'd know to just keep walking forward. Along with that, the lights on the left or right would increase the further away you're turned from the object. So if you're only slightly off center, you may have 3 center lights lit up and a single side light. But if the object is way off to your side, you might have all 5 side lights lit up, indicating that you need to turn really far in that direction to actually face the target. As I messed with it a bit, I found it pretty intuitive to use. However, it's a different story when it came to coding it. Really, it's just a lot of math, figuring out what angles work best and make the most sense and translating that to an indicator on the screen. You'll see me swapping back and forth a lot here as I figure out the approach that feels the most natural. I finished up with the sensor sort of working the way I imagined it, and probably just needing some fiddling with the numbers, so I figured that's what I'd start with once I got back to it. Over the next few days, I thought about the next steps for getting these core features working, and the next time I started working on it, I decided I had two changes to make. One, as nice as having a quickly slapped together environment was to test things out in, I decided I needed an actual prototyping scene. And two, were these sliders. While having a placeholder for what would eventually be a scanning tool was needed, using sliders that move smoothly between 0 and 1 wasn't the best choice for a device that would increment in whole numbers from 0 to 5. Dealing with the sliders was just introducing a lot of complexity to code that I'd eventually have to remove anyway. So, I made those two changes. Now that I had a prototyping scene together, I could continue working on everything I had been, and I replaced the sliders with simple number displays that would show a number between 0 and 5. Once I created the graphic I needed, I could simply map those results to the number of lights to light up. I edited the code a bit to account for this change, and thankfully it didn't take much but swapping a few numbers around and actually removing some of the complicated math I had to do when I was using the sliders. While I was editing it, I also added some more values as serialized, which is Unity and C Sharp's way of allowing me to edit those values in the game editor instead of constantly jumping back to the code. With this done, I spent some time cleaning up the numbers to feel right, so that it'll be ready once I start adding more objects to find and continue with the game. The next thing I wanted was to add a way to display information about everything the player would find while exploring the game world. Since the plan is to have a sort of point-and-click adventure style of way of finding objects of interest, I wanted a way to input and display that data. Input would be the first step. I'd need a name of each item, a picture of it, and a description to display whenever the player found it. There are lots of ways to store data for use by the game, and while there are some that are incredibly easy if not messy, I decided I'd make this my first challenge by learning how to use an XML file as a type of pseudo database. I spent a couple of hours on this, reading tutorials and using example code various people wrote to build and import XML databases in a bunch of different ways. But in the end, as always, the best method is the simplest, and I found how to use C Sharp's built-in XML handling and got it set up. Now I could edit this file to my heart's content, and whenever the game is played, it would create an internal database about each object, the path where a thumbnail for that object would be, and a text description of it. Do you remember at the start of the video I mentioned that I'm still going through various Unity courses online and figure I'll learn better ways to do things after I'm done with this game? Yeah, one of those is for inventory management, and I'm sure it would cover exactly what I needed in this situation, but that's okay. Flailing around like this is how I can learn a lot of different ways to do things and minor details that I might otherwise miss. I set up a few scripts to manage the databases, and as I had already coded the way a player and object could interact and present information when I was setting up the objects in the first place, it was a pretty quick task to hook that into the whole database management and have it start giving real info. Well, as real as I'm a pretty pink cube could be. So with the object information ready to go, I just needed to work on displaying it. This is a step I'm going to need to come back to multiple times to flesh out, but thankfully it's not very difficult in general. I went back to the main GUI I had created at the start and generated a few different panels in it. This would be the pop-up display whenever item info needs to be displayed. It would be off by default, and then when triggered would turn on to show the information. Unity's whole canvas system is neat in that I can edit this 2D plane within the 3D world that just automatically maps to the player screen. Having spent a few hours getting everything else working, this was a breeze, as now I just needed to point the information to the canvas. At the end of the day, I was able to walk up to a pink cube, click on it, and have me tell me what it is via the GUI I set up. Now that I had actually gotten some of the core elements of the game working the way that I wanted, I decided it would be a good time to go back to some environment design. I'm much more a programmer than an artist, so this is likely going to be the most difficult and longest process, but I created a fresh terrain to design on, and using some of Unity's terrain tools I started making a rough, craggy area. I took Unity's default terrain textures as well, and recolored them in GIMP to have a more Martian orange-red tint, and tested the various settings to use when painting those textures on. I spent a night on this actually really getting into it, I didn't realize how fun it could be, and experimenting and generating ideas about what I could do. I'll probably be spending quite a bit of time on this, but I figure if I work on it a bit at a time, I can find the best ways to incorporate all the mechanics I want to have. So that brings us to today. I have a bunch of initially set up game mechanics and features, as well as a pretty clear path to flesh everything out and have this start coming together as a neat, short experience. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and feel free in the comments to offer any suggestions or criticism, as I'm sure there are tons of things I'm going about the wrong way. I hope to see you all again for the next devlog. Bye!